Starting or getting back into amateur radio but you don't have a big budget? Well, buying used equipment could be one way to save money and get on the air. But what's a fair price for a second-hand transceiver, antenna or accessory? Keep watching and find out. First though, I'll tell you what I did. I went to a popular Facebook page or group and asked the people there how much they were willing to pay for a used item in good working condition. I should mention that this Facebook group is mostly VK amateurs here in Australia, so prices might be different in other countries. Another thing is that this group had quite a lot of experienced amateurs. Now that may have depressed prices because people might be willing to pay less for their 21st transceiver than they might be if they were just buying their first transceiver. Or they might be aware of some of the issues with older gear and getting it repaired, so they might offer less money in recognition of that.
We'll go through various transceivers and accessories and bits and pieces, and we have here the very popular ICOM 7300. Now, why would you buy one of those second-hand when you can still buy them new? Good question. However, I did ask the question both in the Australian Ham Radio Facebook page and also on YouTube. You might remember a little while ago I had a question on that, so I've got two lots of audience response there. Anyway, the IC 7300, the Australian survey, there was a group, some people thought that around 1200 was what they'd pay for a used version, and I say working, well presented IC 7300 on the second-hand market. And I think the new they'd sell for about 1500 new from memory here in Australia. Anyway, 38% of you in Australia said 1200. However, quite a lot of you said 900 or less. Maybe it's because if you've got a rig that's relatively new, you'll just buy new, and so it would have to be very cheap to consider buying a second-hand IC 7300. So I'm not sure if I would necessarily trust that, but yeah, from what people tell me, around 1200 Australian is a reasonable price to pay for an ICOM 7300 in good condition. Now on the right, I asked the same question of my YouTube viewers. Many more of them are in the United States. There'll be some in Europe and a minority in Australia. And I used US dollars, and the bulk was 600 US or less for an ICOM 7300. Now I'm not sure how much they go for new in the United States. It'd be less in Australia. Maybe it would be 900, 1000, 1100, possibly, not sure. Anyway, I also added another option. Nothing. I'd buy new for 1100. Oh, there we are. Okay. I checked the US price at the time and they were 1100. So a lot of you would not pay 700, 800 or 900 if you can buy an ICOM 7300 brand new for 1100 US. So you'd have to be very cheap for you to consider buying it at 600 or less. So that's the ICOM 7300, popular HF 6-meter transceiver. It's SDR screen and seems to be a good performer. So that could be a good rig to start off with. if your budget isn't quite so high, and you might just be interested in something that's strictly HF, it won't have 6 motors, won't necessarily have all the modes, definitely not an SDR, it doesn't have a big tube in the middle of the front panel. These are like 1990s, I think, although I think the ICOM 71H, you could still get it well into the 2000s. It might even be a current model, I'm not sure, but anyway, these are HF transceivers. They cover 160 through to 10 motors, general coverage receiver. SSB and CW, not sure if they do AM or FM, one of them might, but these are basically a no-frills transceiver. It runs off 12 volts, so you'd need a separate power supply if you're going to use it at home. You could use it in a vehicle, but it might be a bit large for today's modern vehicles. But yeah, as a starter transceiver to get you on the air on either CW or SSB, you could still connect it up to a computer for digital modes, but don't expect a lot in the way of features. Don't expect advanced noise blankers and bits and pieces. But yeah, around $400 Australian was the most popular price range. A few people, some people said 500, so maybe 420, 430 would be about the average. For a basic 100 watt HF transceiver that could be about 15, 20 years old. And remember, I say that it's working and well presented. I also asked a similar question on YouTube, and the bars for US $300 or $250 or less, very close to equal, much less at 400 and over. So yeah, okay, maybe around 270, 280 is probably about the average, and I'm talking about US dollars there, for a FT840 or IC718. So if you've got one, or if you know of one for sale, and you just want a basic rig for HF, then that's a good choice. Doesn't have all the features, but you'll have a lot of DX contacts. Now another rig, there were different versions. The ICOM 706, I think I remember the first version coming out in about 1995. Then there was the Mark II and Mark IIG. And the first versions just had 6 HF and 6 meters and 2 meters, and the power output dropped off on 6 and 2 meters. I think it might have been 20 watts output on 2 meters. Anyway, 100 watt on HF. It was a very small rig, had a removable detachable front panel, so you might have been able to, I don't know if they were standard, but you could certainly get a separation kit where you could mount the front panel in the front part of your vehicle and have the transceiver itself under your seat. So that was very, very popular as a mobile transceiver, almost a shack in a box basically. Had all your multiple bands and HF. So you could just have one of those transceivers and be on the air, HF, VHF, and for the Mark IIG 70 centimeters as well. Anyway, quite a difference in the price range there. Remember, these are Australian dollars, $700, quite a few people. But that's probably the Mark IIG with 70 centimeters. And it was quite a long running rig. I think it went well into the 2000s. Not sure if it went into the 2010s. Could have done. And then there was some, quite a lot with 400 and under, which seems a bit cheap to me, but that would almost certainly be the original IC706. So if you're after a small HF transceiver, maybe you don't have much room at home, then a 706 can do a lot for you, and that could be considered. You might consider buying it as a choice for a second-hand. Going a bit older, this is if your budget is a bit less. Early to mid 1980s solid-state HF transceivers. Now there are quite a lot of them. I'm talking about the ICOM 751, Kenwood TS440, Yaesu FT757. They sold in quite big numbers in the early to mid 1980s, and compared with rigs that were before, a lot of people would have been upgrading from, say, a Yaesu FT101. Those older rigs would have had valve or tube finals, probably didn't have a digital readout, and almost certainly did not have general coverage receivers. So these transceivers were a bit of a step up in those features, and they operate off 12 volts, so you could use them mobile. But at home you'd need to have a separate power supply, which I'll talk about later. Anyway, most people thought there's quite a lot of consensus around $300 Australian for one of those types of transceivers. Now, bear in mind that these are getting on a bit. They could be 30 or getting on for 40 years old, and some of them did develop problems, dry joints, and there might be difficulties in getting some of the components. You might have to get another one to cannibalize it. So yeah, maybe there's possibly a bit of a risk, certainly compared with buying something with a warranty, but you never know, you might get a good deal on a working early to mid 1980s HF amateur transceiver. So yeah, around $300 is about what people thought one of those was worth. Going back even more, and this is an even more basic rig, I don't think they were necessarily very big sellers in the United States. They were very popular here in Australia and I think in Europe. And this was the Yaesu FT7. It came out, I think, about 1978, 79. The first version had 5 bands, 80, 40, 20, 15, and a part of 10 meters. You could only cover one 500 kilohertz segment. And CW and SSB only, no AM, low power output. I think it was like 10 or 15 watts. I'm not sure, because around this time they were still selling rigs in terms of DC power input. It might have been 25, 30 watt DC power input, but output power was probably maybe 10 or 15 watts. So quite low output power, but they have quite a nice receiver. But they don't have much in the way of fancy stuff with noise blankers or digital signal processing. Don't have a digital dial, although you could get an external accessory that did have a digital dial. There was a later version called the Yaesu FT7B. That was a bit higher power, like 40 or 50 watts. And I think it also did AM, and I think it also covered all of 10 meters in 4 sections. So if you see an FT7B, then that's definitely worth more than an FT7. Anyway, for the FT7, there was quite a wide range in prices. Some people even said, $300, but most people said $150 or less. And bearing in mind that, as well as it not having a digital readout, it was also an analog VFO. So if you're into digital modes where you want really good frequency stability, then the FT7 is probably not the rig for you. Not even a synthesized VFO. With the dial as well, you couldn't set something exact. You might go to the nearest 1 or 2 kilohertz, but without a digital dial, it was hard to set the frequency exactly. Another thing is that it doesn't have 160 meters. Also doesn't have other bands that we've got since the FT7 came out, like 30 meters, 17 meters, 12 meters. It doesn't have those. So it doesn't have 6 meters either. So it's missing about half the bands that a lot of modern rigs have. So it's a very basic transceiver. So if you're looking to start out, you can have a lot of fun with it. It was quite heavy and bulky, or it is by today's standards. By the standards of the time it wasn't, but for its low power output, it's quite heavy for what it was. So that's the Yaesu FT7. If you can afford it, I'd suggest getting something a bit better. Another thing is, this is going back even further. FT101E or TS520. Now, FT101E was Yaesu and TS520 was Kenwood. Now, these rigs were solid state for most of it, except for the final amplifiers. Not sure about the drivers, but I think the final amplifiers at least were tubes. So they are much heavier than modern rigs, they're bulkier. I think they did operate straight off mains power, and they may require some adjustments, especially if you're replacing the final tubes, neutralization and all that. So possibly not something for a beginner. However, they do have a lot of nostalgia value. A lot of people, especially those who started from CB radio, their first amateur radio might have been an FT101E or a TS520. So for people around a certain age, these sorts of transceivers can be quite highly prized. And there is a bit of a difference in the price. Most people, around 35% said $300, some others around $350, and then some said $200 or less. Maybe I'm inclined to think more the $300, $350, but you sometimes see them advertised for a bit more. Then there are variants that came later on. For instance, the TS530 is much, quite a bit of an advance on the 520, and this was in the transition period when we were getting bands like 10, 18 and 24 megahertz. I think the TS520 had those, 530 had those bands. I don't think the 520 did. Then with the Yaesu from the 101E, there was the 101Z. And the 101ZD, which had digital readout. So those, maybe they'd be a bit higher value than what you see here. So yeah, according to what people said, around $300 Australian, maybe a bit more, maybe $350. But no one said, not many people said 400, and no one said 500 or more. So hopefully that gives you an idea. Then I put in a little thing. I used both a Amateur Radio Facebook group and a CB SSB Facebook group. I asked what people thought about the value of 27 megahertz SSB CBs, and in this case, I know there's transceivers that do other things and pirates use them, but I went for a stock standard 40 channel SSB legal 12 volt transceiver. And some people said it's quite flat, $150, $100, 75 or less. Not too many people above 200. This was amongst the amateurs, and I suspect amateurs would be, people talk about amateurs having short arms and deep pockets, but if you can get an all-band, multi-band HF transceiver for like $300 or $400, then that's 100 watt. Then why would you pay big money for a 12 watt CB that only does one band and is only channelized and so limited? So maybe amateurs are thinking of, amateur gear is relatively cheap, then CB should be as well, especially if it does so many less features. So maybe amateurs marked the CB down. So when I asked on the right, the CB group, most people said around $100, but there was also a group that said around $200. I think there might be certain classic models that had a good reputation, maybe the Uniden Grant, maybe there's others that people might have paid a bit more for. Now on to VHF, UHF. If you're looking at starting an amateur radio, some people talk about Baofeng handhelds and those sorts of things, and there's other handhelds that may be a bit nicer, Yaesu, ICOM, etc. But they're very limited. They're typically only 5 watt output, and they are fine if you go portable and have repeaters near you. But if you want to set up 2 meters FM from home or in a vehicle, then ideally you want something with a bit more power, maybe 25 watts. There's some that go up to 40 or 50 watts, but with that sort of power, particularly if you connect a good antenna to it, you'll get much more range. You can have good simplex contacts from home, and you can get much more distant repeaters. So definitely an advantage if you want to set up a ham station at home or in your vehicle. So I asked people about ICOM Yaesu or Kenwood transceivers, 1980s, 1990s type vintage. I suggest that you do have one that has a CTCSS or tone squelch private line. There's different terms for it, but a lot of repeaters, most repeaters in Australia certainly, and a lot in other countries, do need to have that subaudible tone. Otherwise, you won't get into the repeater, and that is so the repeater isn't triggered by interfering signals. So I think if you buy a 2 meter FM transceiver, then it should have that CTCSS function. Another thing that's very desirable is a microphone that's got a DTMF keypad. You can do things like IRLP and other control applications. If the transceiver you see for sale doesn't have that, then it's definitely worth a lot less. Anyway, people thought they were worth around $100, though a lot of people said $75 or less, and a few people said over $150. So consider that as a rough guideline. However, from about the maybe 90s, dual band transceivers became more in 2 meters and 70 centimeters, and depending on the area, some areas do have quite a lot of activity on 70 centimeters. You can buy antennas that are dual band 2 meters and 70 centimeters. You might think, well, okay, you save your money for a little bit longer and get a 2 meter and 70 centimeter mobile FM transceiver. And as you can see from the prices, it costs you a bit more, $200 around there. Some people said $250. But that's a good setup if you're starting out 2 meters and 70 centimeters to have both those bands from either at home or in a vehicle. And I also asked on my YouTube channel in American dollars for a similar type of rig, mobile dual band FM transceiver, and people there thought around 150 US. A few people said under 100. So what I said before about, maybe there's some bigger bargains in some parts of the US. A lot of possibly regional variations. But yeah, maybe $100 you might be lucky and get something. Otherwise 150. A few people willing to pay 200, but yeah, not much more than 200 unless it's a much newer type of unit. But that will get you a 2 meter, 70 centimeter FM mobile transceiver, and to use at home you will need some form of 12 volt power supply. Speaking of which, 13.8 volt high current power supplies. If you're going to be using a 100 watt transceiver, then you need at least 20 amps, and that's continuous, preferably 25 amps, just to give you a bit of wiggle room. It also needs to have a very clean DC output and voltage regulation. Now, there are cheap power supplies you see, switch mode, but they can be noisy and cause interference. So either the heavy transformer type that's regulated, or a high quality low noise switch mode, which will be a bit lighter, but either of those would be acceptable as a power supply. And anyway, most people thought around $150 Australian. A few less thought around $100. So yeah, around $120, $130 or so for a good high current power supply that can run your equipment at home. HF antenna couplers. Now, not all amateurs use them. Some people just like to have things directly fed with coax, but on HF it's good to have them. Even if you've got an antenna with a limited bandwidth, then you might have a coupler in line so you can operate at the edges of the bands. That can sometimes be handy. And I've gone for one that handles at least 100 watts. It's sometimes good to go for a bit heavier, like one that handles 400, 500 watts. They're made of more solid components, so they'll have a bit less loss. And a good antenna coupler will probably also have a VSWR meter in it and also an RF power meter. You might actually have that in your transceiver, but antenna coupler will also have those features. So There's a bit of a range in prices. There are different brands, like the Kenwood, Yaesu made them, MFJ did. Maybe that's one of the cheaper ones. But anyway, it was between about $100 and $200 is what you'll pay for an antenna coupler. If you're running a big HF linear amplifier, then you'll need a bigger antenna coupler to handle the power. So you'd expect to pay more than that. Desk microphone. Now, most HF SSB transceivers come with a mobile microphone that you can hold in hand. That's perfectly fine. But some people, especially, some people like to have boom microphones. Some have microphones that you've got headphones and a microphone thing projecting out. Headset, yeah. Others like a microphone on the desk. So it's up to your taste. If you're active on HF, if you're like talking a lot, if you do a lot of contesting, so you're at the radio for a long time, then a desk microphone may be better than just having a handheld microphone. Now, people that go after everything being matching might get one specifically for their transceiver. In other cases, you might get one for another rig, but you may have to rewire the microphone connection for it to suit. Anyway, people thought around $100, maybe a little bit more, was reasonable to pay for a desk microphone. But if I were you, I would, if you're really short for cash, give it a miss. For now, a handheld microphone will be fine. Spend your money instead on other things like a higher antenna that will really boost your signal. In that category, matching external speakers. Now, I think this is a real vanity product. Some people absolutely love to have a full line of equipment with their matching transceiver, the power supply, the antenna coupler, the desk mic, and yes, the external speaker. And they'll pay money, even if it's second-hand. But when you have a look inside it, it's pretty much a box full of air. Some of them had little audio filters in them, but yeah. A matching speaker is something that you would only buy if you've got lots of money and willing to spend it on something that doesn't improve your signal at all. Because if you wanted to, you could just go to a second-hand shop, charity shop, and get an old stereo speaker sold on a plug, plugs into your transceiver, and that will probably work just as well as a matching external speaker. So, yeah, if looks are important and if you've got spare cash, then people thought around $75 was reasonable. Quite a few people said 50 or less. Guy there said buy decent headphones. Yep, some people find headphones are better. A few people were willing to pay $100 or $150 for matching external speaker. But yeah, if you're a beginner on a budget, very last priority. Look at other things first. Now, antennas, HF trap verticals. I put this in because if you've only got a small courtyard but want to operate on popular HF bands like 40 meters, 20 meters, 15 and 10, maybe some of the other bands in between, maybe even 80 meters, then a vertical can get you on multiple bands. Not the greatest of performance necessarily, but it will get you on the air, and if you're using a mode like FT8, you can still work stations all over the world, and even sometimes on CW and SSB. Anyway, most people thought around $150, although there was a bit of a range from 100 to 200, and some people thought 300 or more. So there's probably, because of variations in products, whether it had 80 meters, whether it had other bands. So yeah, a trap vertical that you can put up around $150, $200 possibility. Also, for 2 meters and 70 centimeters, I mentioned the dual band FM transceivers before. You'll need an antenna for it. A lot of people build their own antennas, and especially for a single band, it's quite easy to build a single band antenna. But if you want something that's neat and does multiple bands, then people do often go for a commercially made antenna. And like there's a diamond vertical, for instance, on 2 meters, 70 centimeters. Anyway, most common, there was pretty much a consensus here. People were paying around $75 Now the antenna lengths vary. Some have longer, have higher gain. Some might have 6 meters or even 23 centimeters. But for a basic 2 meter, 70 centimeter vertical, pay around $75 Australian. Now coaxial cable. Now this was an interesting one because it's as I say in the text there, vital link between your transceiver and antenna. And if you've got loss in your coaxial cable and it's particularly high on VHF and UHF, then a lot of your signal gets lost before it makes its way to the antenna, and it also reduces your sensitivity on receive. So you do need good quality coax cable, particularly if it's a long length. And I asked questions that it's like, if you're in the right place at the right time, and you know where the coaxial cable's been, then you can get some good bargains. I mentioned RG213, though people seriously into VHF might go for something a lower loss. But most of you, 58%, said coax is too important to risk buying used, because you can have cases where water gets into the coax in one end and it might visually look okay, but it's lossy. I have done other videos where I looked at the loss of some coaxial cable. I think it was RG58, and it was quite severe. It was quite old coax. So yeah, most of you said too important to risk buying used. So if you're going to buy a part of your station new, then coax cable, I think, is probably a good use for you. Now, I'm not too far off the end, but I did ask people about laptop computers. Like, even though you might already have a home PC, you might want a little computer just for radio stuff, like logging or digital modes and antenna modeling, just something to keep in the shack. Anyway, the biggest number of groups said $100 or less for a little laptop. But there's still a good number that said 200 and slightly less 300. So quite a wide range of prices that you're willing to pay for a secondhand laptop computer. And then there's some others that just said, I'd only buy new. So yeah, so that's also another. Final question. I put in a lot of options here. What amateur item would you be least inclined to buy second-hand? And I already discussed coaxial cable before, but when we look at some of the other things, it was basically things that cost a lot of money. And these are where there's a high risk of things going wrong because of bulk, weight, parts missing, fragility, or poor value versus buying new. All these sort of things could be why people don't buy second-hand and buy new instead. Anyway, the biggest thing that people thought was risky when buying second-hand was HF transceivers worth over $1,000. People think, well, for around that price, you can buy something new. So you have to be thinking, it's a serious purchase, and people think, okay, well, either buy something cheap second-hand that can tide me over, and people were quite willing to buy HF transceivers that were less than $1,000, and then maybe later on save up and buy an HF transceiver, but buy it new with the warranty, buy the latest model, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, not many, a lot of people didn't want or were uncomfortable with buying used HF transceivers worth over $1,000. The other item that people were inclined not to, large HF linear amplifiers, probably because of freight and fragility, risk of things going wrong. Heavy duty tower as well. Yep, things can go wrong with towers unless you know a bit about structural engineering or you know who's owned the tower and if it's been looked after, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, they were the things that people were least inclined to buy new.
The other thing I haven't mentioned is, where do you get the equipment from? Well, there's several sources. I won't go into a lot of detail. Facebook Marketplace, one possibility. eBay, Hamfests, Radio Club, There you're more likely to know the person you're buying the equipment from and might actually see the item rather than having to trust someone that they'll send it in the mail and it will get to your place okay. Another possibility in some areas, if there's still ham radio dealers, you might be able to buy used there if they trade equipment and possibly even get a short warranty. That will be a bit more expensive than buying privately, but you've got a bit of assurance that there's a warranty and backup if there's something wrong. Sometimes though, buying used is not necessarily that much cheaper than buying new. So buying new might actually be better. And you get all the things like the warranty, you get everything complete, and even that new smell of opening the box. Just to sum up, it might be better getting your transceiver new if the price isn't all that much more than used. Coaxial cable, that's another one because you really need that to be in good condition. Other cases though, with various accessories like speakers, microphones, I reckon they're probably overpriced. Some things like matching extension speakers are what I'd call vanity products. You don't need one to get absolutely tip-top performance from your transceiver. You only get it if you like the idea of having a whole table with everything from the one series of equipment or matching. Then yeah, you might buy an extension speaker for that and you'll probably pay quite a bit of money for that. But you look inside them and it's pretty much all air. If you're on a budget, then no, there's better ways. You could even go to a charity shop, get an old stereo speaker, might be only $5 or $10, and just solder a plug on, and there's your extension speaker. And that will probably sound as good as the one that would have come with the transceiver if you got a whole matching package. So yeah, that's one of the big ways you can save money on some of the accessories. Antenna building as well. Of course, I've done lots of videos on building antennas. Most of them are for portable antennas, but you could build it a bit heavier and have something you can have permanently at home and get some really good performance. And you've also got a bit of the personal element of having a part of the station that you've built yourself. That gives you a bit of extra pleasure in using it as well. So that's definitely an option, even if you buy the transceiver new. Some of the important things like coaxial cable new, other stuff you could buy secondhand or even build yourself. So that's what I've got to offer today. Hope you liked it. Let me know your comments below on your experiences in purchasing secondhand gear and if you've got any further tips you want to add. I look forward to reading your comments and hopefully other people do too. Enjoy these videos? Want to start in amateur radio? Well, check out my books, Ham Radio Get Started for USA readers and the Australian Ham Radio Handbook for those in Australia. For more information, visit my website VK3YE.com or search their titles on Amazon.